Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep look at a stack of sources that, well, they really challenge how we think about history, power, and property. We are heading to Jamaica, but we're not just focused on the usual things like tourism or politics. We're drilling down into something far more foundational.
Something physical.
Exactly. The surprising essential connection between the church and real estate. I mean, specifically land ownership, settlement patterns, and economic security right across the island's entire history.
It's a fantastic topic because the spiritual and the material are just, they're inseparable here.
Right.
Our mission today is to trace this connection, not just through a spiritual lens, but through geography and economy. We're essentially following a blueprint, a map drawn by religious institutions showing how they became massive landowners, essential settlement anchors.
And instruments of advocacy.
Ultimately instruments of political and social advocacy, yeah.
Well, exactly. We're looking at how a church's physical footprint could actually define a community's ability to survive and thrive. And this is a long view story. We're talking half a millennium.
A very long view.
And the sources drive home this one crucial point. Land in Jamaica has never just been a commodity. It is the foundation that shapes power, wealth, identity, and most critically, a sense of belonging.
That's the key word, belonging.
So if you really want to understand modern Jamaica, you have to understand who structured the land and why.
And that structure begins with a fundamental collision of worldviews. We have to start with the pre-colonial logic.
Okay, let's unpack this collision. So before the Spanish arrive, you have the Taino communities, the original inhabitants. And they viewed their relationship with the land in ways that are just completely foreign to the European concepts of, like, deeds and titles.
Absolutely. For the Taino, land was understood through community practice, through kinship ties, and through deeply spiritual meanings.
So not something you could just buy or sell.
Not at all. They were deeply connected to specific places, water sources, caves, high hills, that mattered for spiritual ceremony and cultural life, just as much as they mattered for sustenance. There was just no concept of private saleable property in the modern sense. Land was held through shared practice.
And then, 1494, the Spanish arrive.
And everything changes.
The Catholic missions come with them, and this is the moment the church formally enters the real estate conversation for the first time.
Yeah.
But not as a spiritual guide.
No, as an instrument of empire.
Right.
Precisely. The Catholic missions were integral to Spanish settlement and control. So when the Spanish established their villas, their administrative hubs, they simultaneously introduced the entire European legal framework for property.
And what did that look like?
Well, this framework was based on the idea of land being granted by the crown, formally held by individuals or institutions, and then officially recorded in some kind of central registry.
So the placement of the church wasn't just random. It was foundational to town planning. You place the cathedral, you place the administrative offices, and the whole settlement just builds around that stabilizing anchor.
It's the origin story, really. The idea that the church is a fixed, central landmark tied directly to the governing authority.
And that creates a geographic pattern that proves to be incredibly resilient.
Incredibly. Even after the Spanish era, that core idea that the church is the administrative and physical anchor of a legitimate community, it just persisted. It became the legal and symbolic backbone of all future property law, even when the players changed.
Which brings us to the British conquest in 1655.
A huge shift.
The focus of the entire island shifted brutally to the sugar economy, and plantations became the ultimate real estate product, these vast tracts of land concentrating all the wealth and power into a tiny elite.
And the land ownership structures, they evolved to reflect that brutality. The established Church of England, the Anglican Church, became institutionally intertwined with the colonial administration.
And this is a crucial detail.
It's everything. The parishes, which, still define Jamaica's geography today, they were not just church jurisdictions, they were the formal civic units of governance.
That's so vital to understand.
Yeah.
We're not talking about any kind of separation of church and state.
Not at all.
If you lived in 18th century Jamaica, the parish church handled every single aspect of your civic life, keeping records of births, marriages, burials,
Collecting local taxes, poor relief.
even managing basic infrastructure like roads. Structurally, the church was the local state.
And this placed the established church in a deeply uncomfortable and often complicit position during the era of slavery. Their entire existence, their endowments, their land holdings, their very structure was woven into the fabric of the plantation order.
They owned property.
They owned property, they administered property laws, and they were legally embedded in a system that designated human beings as property.
So on one side, you have this huge concentration of land wealth in the estates and the Anglican Church, while the vast majority of the population, the enslaved, had absolutely no legal claim to land whatsoever.
That is the property reality of the era. But, and this is important, the sources show us a counterbalance emerging.
The nonconformist churching.
The nonconformist churches, we're talking about the Baptists, the Methodists, the Moravians, the Presbyterians.
Who weren't part of the colonial administration. In fact, they were often viewed with a lot of suspicion by the ruling class.
Exactly. These mission stations and chapels, they started building communities near the enslaved populations, often in marginal or difficult-to-access areas.
And what was their focus?
Education and literacy. They were providing an organizational structure outside of the plantation's direct control. And the physical structure of these chapels, often small, tucked away, became a meeting ground, a place where identity and leadership could be nurtured.
It created a duality, didn't it? The church building itself could be both a shelter, a safe space for community organizing, and at the same time a site of surveillance.
Depending entirely on the political leanings of the missionary and the intensity of the colonial crackdown at any given time, it was a very fine line to walk.
A very fine line.
It was. And you can't really grasp the land issue without looking at the concept of the provision grounds.
Okay, what were those?
So even though enslaved people were legally property, they were often allocated small plots of marginal land by the estate owners to grow their own food.
And this wasn't charity. This was just a practical necessity.
Purely practical. The estates needed the enslaved people to feed themselves, so the owners didn't have to bear the entire cost of upkeep.
But there was a powerful consequence to this.
A huge one. These provision grounds, cultivated intensely over generations, became the first lived reality of land use rights. They weren't formal ownership, no, but they established a de facto relationship with the soil, an expectation of legacy, and proof that freed people could successfully manage and cultivate land away from the estate's direct supervision.
Which sets the stage for everything that comes next.
Every-
All of that structural tension, the concentration of land, the power of the state church, the hidden organizing of the mission churches, and the quiet dignity of the provision grounds, it all comes to a head after emancipation in 1838. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the central question for the newly freed people was immediate and practical. How do we get land security? How do we build independent lives away from the estates that just held us captive?
And the estate owners, they anticipated this. They tried to maintain control by keeping rent high and refusing to sell small plots of land.
The assumption being they'd have no choice but to come back and work for wages on the sugar fields.
Exactly. But the churches, particularly the Baptist Missionary Society and other nonconformist groups, they offered a massive strategic intervention.
This is the moment they pivot. They go from being spiritual guides to, well, powerful real estate developers.
That's a perfect way to put it. They created the free villages.
And these weren't just spiritual projects.
Not at all. These were explicit, planned, real estate projects. The churches raised funds, sometimes from congregations back in Britain, to purchase huge tracts of undeveloped or marginal estate land.
And then what?
They systematically surveyed it, subdivided it, and sold small plots, often just 1 to 5 acres, to the newly freed families.
Which sounds simple, but it was absolutely revolutionary. It gave people not just a house, but a permanent, titled place to stand that was politically and physically separate from estate control.
It broke the cycle.
It completely broke the cycle of economic dependence.
And notice the strategic anchors of these settlements. Every single one was built around a church and a school.
The same two things.
The church provided the shared identity, the moral compass, the structure for community governance, and the school provided literacy and the path for upward mobility. That pairing, it transformed a patch of dirt into a stable, moral community.
So the church literally created the legal and social blueprint for village life in Jamaica. You can draw a straight line from these mid-19th century free villages, places like Sligaville, the first one, or Kettering, to the modern map and the logic of hundreds of rural communities across the island today.
That's the so what of it. The property title might be modern, but the idea of community stability anchored by the church is centuries old. It showed that land could be redistributed in a just, economically viable way, fostering an independent peasantry focused on small-scale agriculture rather than the failed plantation model.
The success of these free villages, it must have just solidified the church's reputation as this trustworthy, permanent institution.
Absolutely. And that set the stage for their long-term role as major real estate landmarks, starting in the 1860s as the economy diversified.
Right, because as the landscape shifted toward independent small-scale farming, churches kept expanding their physical footprint.
They did. You see more chapels, meeting halls, and extensive cemeteries. But they didn't just occupy land, they occupied strategic land.
How so? What do you mean by strategic?
Well, they located themselves at crossroads or in town centers or often on elevated ground, which made them physically resilient to flooding and highly visible.
Undeniable landmarks.
Undeniable long-term landmarks. I mean, if you were looking for a place in rural Jamaica, turn left at the Baptist church became the navigational code. Their permanence, their stability maintained across decades, even when government infrastructure failed, made their real estate holdings invaluable community assets.
And if we fast forward to the mid-20th century, with the rapid urbanization, Kingston exploding, the church's role adapts again.
It does. It shifts from land redistribution to community stabilization.
A crucial pivot.
It is. In these rapidly growing urban centers, especially in informal settlements where state infrastructure was lagging behind, church facilities stepped in to fill the gap.
They became de facto community centers.
De facto community centers, hosting youth clubs, serving as hubs for disaster relief, acting as political and social centers.
And they became the mediators of community recognition, because in many of these areas, land titles were non-existent or unclear.
Exactly. So a person might not have had a formal legal deed, but their tenure, their right to be there, was recognized by the community. And that recognition was often reinforced by their long-standing ties to the local church and the family networks that came with it.
That social recognition is key.
It is. It creates an informal security of tenure that sometimes runs counter to the formal legal system. And this brings us right up to the modern day, where that historical influence is still deeply felt, particularly around issues of legacy and inheritance.
We're talking specifically about the complexity of family land. For anyone unfamiliar, what exactly does that concept entail, and why is it so intertwined with the church?
So family land is one of the most unique and challenging aspects of Jamaican property law. It's land that is owned communally by generations of descendants, often without clear, updated formal titles.
So it passes down through kinship ties.
Right, through inherited kinship ties rather than being formally registered or probated under modern legal statutes. The idea is that it ensures the family always has a piece of ground to return to, but it makes formal transactions, like getting a mortgage, nearly impossible.
And the church often acts as a steward or mediator in this inherently complex framework.
Exactly. The church offers continuity and structure where the legal framework often fails the people. Church leaders are frequently called upon, even today, to serve as trusted mediators when disputes arise over boundary lines or succession rights within a family land plot or the contentious sale of shared land.
They provide a moral authority.
A moral and social authority that transcends the technicalities of the court system.
It's fascinating how the church's function has evolved. From colonial administrator to land redeemer to modern-day dispute resolver, but always centered around the physical reality of land and belonging.
The history we've traced shows that the history of church and land in Jamaica is one continuous story. The map, the village structure, the way communities organize themselves, it all flows from this centuries-long partnership.
And this enduring relationship, from the sacred Taino caves to the strategic free villages to the modern suburban halls, it's ultimately seeking to answer that fundamental human question: where do we belong?
That's it. The church provided belonging in spirit and community, creating a stable moral identity. And by acquiring and distributing land, they provided the physical means for belonging in place and achieving economic security.
So what does this all mean for you as you reflect on this history? When you look at modern Jamaican real estate today, the formal valuations, the complex titles, the development approvals, how much of that process is still subtly influenced by the embedded, centuries-old village logic that was physically built around the church?
Right.
What happens when a modern legal title, maybe one that was fraudulently acquired, conflicts with a community recognition and a family tie to the land that has been established, reinforced, and mediated by the church for 3 generations?
Yeah.
That is the deep, persistent thread worth pulling on.